Schism is the fifth song on the 2001 masterpiece of an album, Lateralis by Tool. It was the first single to be released on the album and was met with critical acclaim, as well as the band receiving a Grammy for Best Metal Performance in 2002. The song is renowned for its rhythmic complexity and frequent meter changes. Wikipedia states that it changes time signature more than 45 times. The combination of the biting, dark guitar tones of Adam Jones, the solid-as-a-rock polyrhythmic drum grooves of Danny Carey, the chameleon-esque, aggressive, yet pensive and yearning vocals of Maynard, and the iconic, huge, thundering bass tone of Justin Chancellor paints a vivid portrait of a crumbling, dying world divided by the schism. And while breakdowns of communication and fundamental differences make consolidation seem hopeless, sometimes even the most disparate pieces can be brought back together. While I agree that the song is complex and a challenge to play, I found that many make it out to be more difficult than it actually is. So I wanted to analyze the song and talk through it piece by piece so we can truly understand what the hell is going on. Schism lacks the typical verse, chorus, bridge structure common to rock and pop music, but can be broken down into multiple different sections that, in turn, can be broken down into smaller parts themselves. I'll be looking at each of these parts separately and how they work within the song as a whole. The song opens with a solo bass playing a small motif comprised of 4 intervals: D and B flat, F and A, G and C, and A and D. These imply the chords B flat major, F major, C major, and D minor, which, as we will see, are echoed later in the song. While this does help to establish the key and set the tone for the song, it's also foreshadowing chordal motifs that will appear later in the song. Tool are masterful with their use of motif, taking a few motifs and bending and stretching them through different times and keys. This gives the song unity and makes it feel like a cohesive whole rather than a collection of random elements. Think of Beethoven's Fifth, that iconic 4-note motif that Beethoven creates a whole song around. This is what Tool has done with Schism. Though the song goes through many moods and changes, it never loses sight of its overall theme. As we will see as we analyze further, there are many different parts to this puzzle, but each piece is connected in one way or another. This is just good songwriting, and should be the goal of any songwriter, whether they are writing an opera, a complex heavy metal song, or a 4-chord pop song. Let's take a look at the first piece of this puzzle. Now, whenever I see people talking about this motif, they describe it as being 1 bar of 5/8 and 1 bar of 7/8. The reason they do this is because the beats or the pulses created by the motif create the feel of a bar of 5/8 and 1 of 7/8. But I feel this is a needlessly complicated way of describing it, and here's why. If we think of these 2 bars as one single bar, we end up with a bar of 12 eighth notes, or 12/8. 12/8 is far more common and easier to understand, especially at first glance, than a bar of 5/8 and a bar of 7/8, but I'm not quite done. Now, this bar of 12/8 can be split into 2, to be 2 bars of 6/8 or 2 bars of 3/4, and this is how I prefer to count and feel this motif. The motif lines up perfectly with 2 bars of 3/4. Now, if you were learning this song, what would you prefer? To see this and have to count 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 2, or to see this and count in 3/4? I know what I'd prefer. Another reason I like to feel it in 3 is that with the pulses landing on the beat for the first bar and then off for the second, it creates a tension, a push and a pull, a divide that right from the get-go establishes the schism, the whole theme of the song. The motif is made up of 3 components: a triplet flourish at the beginning, a low droning open D string, and the higher melody notes. While the droning D helps to establish the tonal center of the song, technically D Dorian, as we'll see in a second, the higher notes introduce the melody of the verse that will soon be doubled by Maynard's voice. After a couple of bars of bass, by itself, the drums and the guitar enter. The guitar is playing the exact same riff as the bass, but a fifth away, and if we look at what the notes are, we can see that it plays a B natural. This firmly establishes the song in the key of D Dorian. D Dorian is the second mode of the C Ionian scale, more commonly referred to as the C major scale. It is what you get if you play a C major scale but start from the second note, or all the white notes on the piano starting from a D. The scale that is commonly referred to as a D minor scale can also be called D Aeolian and contains not a B natural but a B flat. This is a slightly darker sounding scale than the Dorian and, as you can hear, changes the sound of Schism entirely, mostly because of the diminished fifth or the devil's interval that is now present due to the B flat. The refrain that comes at the end of each verse, for lack of a better term, is a great example of how Tool can completely change the tone and feel of a motif by simply changing one note. Here's what it looks like. And if you look closely, you'll see that the only thing that has changed is that this eighth note has been swapped out for a quarter note. The rest of the motif is exactly the same. But because of this added eighth note, the pulses are offset by that amount, making them land on different beats and thus changing the whole feel of the motif. Instead of feeling like two magnets pushing and pulling at each other in a delicately balanced dance, it now feels like a powerful driving train. Now, technically you could write this out as a bar of 13/8. That might be simpler, but writing it out as one bar of 6/8, 2/4, and 3/8 helps us to see where the beats lie. How does it do that, you might rightly ask? Well, 6/8 and 3/8 are compound times. That means that the beats aren't dictated by the standard note length as they would be in 4/4 or 3/4 or 5/4. Let's take 4/4. 4/4 tells us that there are 4 quarter notes per bar or measure, and the beats or strong pulses that outline the feel of the time fall where those quarter notes are. This is standard time, the same for 3/4 or 5/4 or 6/4. You can hear it when you listen to a song like this. In compound time, the beat is not always as obvious to point out. In 6/8 time, the beat falls on the first and the fourth eighth note of the bar. It sounds like this. And 3/8 is just half of 6/8, so the beat falls on the first eighth note, like this. Here's how the beat falls through one bar of 6/8, one bar of 2/4, and one of 3/8. Try clapping along. With all that in mind, let's look back at this motif from the refrain. Now, if we try to clap through the motif, keeping in mind where the beats fall, it makes perfect sense. And check out what Danny Carey is doing. He's outlining those beats with the kick and the snare drums. It's this cohesion between the instruments, especially in a song that is so rhythmically complex and contains so many time changes, that binds the song together and makes it sound so smooth and seamless. It's like listening to an amazing jazz band play in an odd time like 7/8. They are so comfortable playing in that odd time that sometimes you'd swear they were just playing in 4/4. Now, after the verse and the refrain happen twice, the song progresses to a bridge of sorts. This is one of my favorite parts of the song. The feel changes from the more floaty, dissonant feel of the verse to a really driving, hard rock feel. Maynard is really showing off his impressive vocal chops, belting up to a high G and A, which is well into the tenor range. Danny Carey is laying down a driving, hard rock beat, and Adam Jones is busting out those crunchy power chords. Though it does sound very different for a number of reasons, this section also has quite a few similarities to the verse. Remember how we talked about the pulses or the beats that were implied by the first motif? They fell on the first and the second beat of the first bar, and then the second half, or the and, of the third beat of the first bar, and the ands of the first and second beats of the second bar. Now, this new motif is a bar of 6/4 or 2 bars of 3/4, and check out where the band is laying it down. The first beat and the second beat of the first bar, and the and of the third beat of the first bar, and the ands of the first and second beats of the second bar. Isn't that fantastic? Yes, it's a completely new sound and feel from the verses, but it still has that connection to the original motif, and as a result fits perfectly into the mix of the song. Yet another example of how Tool so deftly crafts their music to cohesive perfection. Okay, on to another of my favorite parts of the song. I have a few. The climax of the first section of the song, and this one is a real brain twister. We start at the refrain, and the first thing that happens is the bar of 2/4 and the bar of 3/8 are combined, and another eighth note is added to the end to create a bar of 4/4. This time, the addition of the eighth note doesn't change the feel too wildly, but does help to set up the next section. Danny Carey clearly outlines the 4/4 with a fill on the toms, and at this point, the guitar kind of parts ways with the bass and the drums. It continues on its motif, which just so happens to be the second part of the main motif repeated. We'll check this out in more detail in a second, but first I want to take a look at what the drums and the bass are doing. This new section is a combination of a bar of 9/8 and a bar of 5/8. The bass is playing a descending A minor scale with all the notes except one landing on the beat of each bar. Remember how I said that in 6/8 the beats fell on the first and the fourth notes? Well, 9/8 is simply a bar of 6/8 with 3 more notes, so the next beat would come on the 7th note here. And that last note of the scale is played on the first beat of the 5/8 bar. Now, the beats of a 5/8 bar are felt exactly the same as in a 6/8 bar, except there's an 8th note missing from the end of the bar. And the drums, again, support this figure by outlining the beats with the kick drum and the crash cymbals. He even does this nifty little fill on the toms for the last 3 notes of the 9/8 bar to lead us into the 5/8 bar, and lays down the beats through the 5/8 bar with those cymbals. Now, let's get back to what the guitar is doing. Like I said before, Adam Jones is playing the second half of the main motif and repeating it. Now, if you remember back to the beginning, I said the second half of the motif could be considered to be a bar of 7/8. So, that's what we have, a motif that is 7/8 notes long. Now, when I first heard this section, I thought that the figure the bass and the drums were playing went out of sync with the guitar, but eventually landed back in the same place after a few times around. But this isn't the case. It simply sounds that way because the bass and the drums are playing at a different time from the guitar, and it creates this fantastic polyrhythmic sound that totally messes with your head but works really well. Polyrhythm is exactly as the name implies. It describes music that has 2 or more seemingly conflicting rhythms happening at the same time. Composers from all genres of music incorporate polyrhythms into their music, from jazz to metal to classical to prog and even pop music. Does this rhythm sound familiar? Just as complex extended harmony creates tension in a song, so too does polyrhythm, and its use at this point in the song is a perfect creative choice. At a time where the tension is rising and everything is ramped up to 11, it pushes the intensity into overdrive so that this first climactic moment in the song really hits hard. It sounds like this world has reached a breaking point. The 2 opposing sides have been pushed too far apart to maintain the dissonant but balanced connection they previously had, so the world is ripping in 2, and the song echoes that by literally splitting in 2. But how do these seemingly opposite pieces fit together so well? If we add together the total number of 8 notes in the drum and bass figure, we get 9 plus 5, 14. So in total, a bar of 14/8. If we add together the total number of 8 notes in 2 lots of the motif containing 7/8 notes, we get 14, another bar of 14/8. So even though the 2 figures are felt completely differently, they both contain the same number of notes in total and therefore line up perfectly. It's genius. As the world comes crashing down in a climax of dissonant synthesis, we're left with nothing but a barren wasteland. The sound of a lone guitar droning through the void, layers of wobbling notes drowned in phaser fading in and out, and a new motif is established. Just a little side note, we have shifted from D minor to A minor at this point. It all happened in the chaos of that climax. It should, by now, come as no surprise to you that this new motif is still very much attached to the original ones in many ways. The first obvious similarity is the low droning note, this time in the key of A minor. The second is the melody notes floating over top. What's missing is the triplet flourish, but it still holds some rhythmic similarities that relate back to the first half of the song. At first glance, the motif is very much in 12/8 time until the last few beats here, where it switches to 3/4. This changing from compound to standard time throws you off a bit when trying to count through what was otherwise a standard 12/8 feel, and is a small hint to the chaos we just left behind. It also harks back to earlier in the song in the refrains at the ends of the verse, and the change from 6/8 to 2/4 time. And like I said then, yes, technically you could count through this without changing to 3/4 time, but the beats that are implied very strongly by the melody and the bass note lead it more towards 3/4 time, and make it easier for us to count and feel. This section of the song also contains some of my favorite lyrics of any song. Cold silence has a tendency to atrophy any sense of compassion, and this dim yet accurate sentiment is echoed in the eerie openness of the music. Remember back to how I said that Aeolian has a much darker sound than Dorian? Well, you get to hear that in this section. Check out what the bass plays once it joins the guitar here. Everything is in unison up until this sneaky little note here. This F natural grounds us firmly in the key of A, Aeolian, and adds a dark twist to the motif that, until this point, was far more longing and melancholy, a suggestion that even though things seem calm now, they may not remain that way for long. And indeed, it's right. The motif changes gear once again, bringing back that triplet flourish, ushering the drums back in. The bass drum plays a solid, driving rhythm on every note of the bar as the band crescendos into the most intense section of the song. Here we find a combination of many of the elements the band used previously to create tension and drive in a microcosm of pure awesome. The first and most striking element is the amazing polyrhythm that is happening. The voice, guitar, and bass are very grounded in this 12/8 compound time, followed by a bar of 7/8. That seemed clear when I first listened to this section, but I was always a little confused as to what Danny Carey was doing until I analysed it. Check this out. Here's what he's playing expressed in 12/8 and 7/8. Seems fine enough, but look at what happens if we turn this into 4/4 time. The drum pattern lines up perfectly as a straight 4/4 rock beat. So we have most of the band, the voice, the bass, and the guitar, playing a compound 12/8 and 7/8 time while the drums are happily grooving along in 4/4 underneath. It's insane, but so badass at the same time. It very much reminds me of the drumming on Black Dog by Led Zeppelin. On one hand, it doesn't seem to mesh, but on the other, it totally lines up and makes sense. And for this song, it's perfect, since the theme that runs through the whole of the song is the divide, the disconnect, the schism. If you'll remember right back to the beginning of the song, even before the first motif, the bass played 4 chords, and I said, which, as we will see, are echoed later in the song. While this does help to establish the key and set the tone for the song, it's also foreshadowing chordal motifs that will appear later in the song. Well, guess what? Here they are, slamming you right in the face amidst this cacophony of polyrhythms, sky-high wailing vocals, and massive bass lines. Those 4 chords that started off this whole epic journey coming back to us in the climactic finale of the song. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. This internal consistency, cohesion, commitment to an idea, to motif, to developing that idea, makes the song gel as a whole and turns what could have been a jumbled mess of random, rhythmically complex ideas and themes into a masterpiece that, while dealing with the ideas of division and separation, managed to remain a cohesive, coherent whole from start to finish. The last lines that Maynard sings, "I know the pieces fit," sung over the same broken 3/4 time that began the song, could easily be taken as stubborn, foolish, and futile for hanging on to something that you know is broken. But I think, in the context of this song, considering the themes, both lyrically and musically, of division, tension, longing, and despair, as well as unity, belief, and hope, despite the former, shows us that even when it all seems hopeless and broken, even the most antithetical pieces can be brought back together. Hey guys, thanks for watching. This one really took me a while with all the research and production required, but I'm really pleased with how it turned out. I know it's completely different from what I normally do on this channel, but I'm hoping to do more like it. For example, I have a similar video planned for Bohemian Rhapsody, but I will be continuing to make more social justice content as well. If you liked this video, please press the like button, and if you want to see more content like this, then I would love for you to subscribe and make sure you press the little bell so you get notified when a new video comes out. If you'd like to support me and my content, then even $1 a month is a huge help for me, so I would love for you to consider becoming one of my patrons over on Patreon. My current patrons are on the screen as we speak, and I'd like to thank them all for their continued support. I'm eternally grateful. Much love. See you soon.